One phone call. That's all it took to expose the fault lines running beneath Maple Valley Estate's pristine lawns and picture-perfect homes. Sarah Mitchell thought she was protecting her neighborhood when she dialed 911 that morning. She didn't expect her daughter to find out. She didn't expect the police officer to be someone who knew her, and she certainly didn't expect what happened next. Sarah Mitchell stood at her bay window, phone clutched tightly in her manicured hand, as she watched the moving truck pull up across the street. Maple Valley Estates hadn't seen new residents in over 2 years, and certainly none quite like this. The Harris family, Marcus, an accomplished cardiothoracic surgeon, his wife Renee, a university professor, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Marcus Jr. and 8-year-old Zara, were about to become the first black family in this affluent suburban enclave. The morning sun cast long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns as the moving truck's hydraulic lift whirred to life. Sarah's fingers trembled as she dialed 911, her other hand drawing the sheer curtains closed just enough to remain hidden while maintaining her view of the street. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was steady, professional. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper, though she was alone in her house. Yes, hello, I'm calling because there are suspicious individuals moving furniture into 472 Maple Valley Drive. They claim they bought the house, but I've never seen them before, and they don't look like they belong here. Ma'am, can you describe what you're seeing that appears suspicious? Sarah watched as Marcus Jr. carried a box labeled basketball trophies, while his father guided a leather sectional down the truck's ramp. They're moving things in, but something doesn't feel right. The house just sold last month, and nobody informed the neighborhood association about new residents. Are you witnessing any criminal activity? Well, no, but, ma'am, moving into a house during daylight hours is not typically considered suspicious activity. Are you certain this isn't simply a family moving into their new home? Before Sarah could respond, she noticed her next-door neighbor, Eleanor Wong, walking across the street with what appeared to be a welcome basket. Eleanor, a retired judge who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, had always been the unofficial welcome wagon of Maple Valley Estates. I need to go, Sarah muttered, hanging up quickly as she watched Eleanor embrace Renee Harris warmly. Something twisted in Sarah's stomach, a combination of embarrassment and another emotion she couldn't quite name. Across the street, Renee Harris was already falling into easy conversation with Eleanor, their laughter carrying across the morning air. Marcus Jr. had stopped unloading boxes to pet Eleanor's golden retriever, Buddha, while little Zara twirled in circles on the front lawn, her yellow sundress catching the breeze. Sarah's phone buzzed, a message from the neighborhood Facebook group she'd created 3 years ago. Welcome to our new neighbors at 472. The Harris family is joining us from Boston. Dr. Marcus Harris will be joining the cardiac team at Memorial Hospital, and Dr. Renee Harris will be teaching African American literature at the university. Looking forward to having them at next month's block party. Eleanor. The post already had 12 likes and several welcome comments. Sarah's thumb hovered over her phone screen, her earlier 911 call now feeling like a lead weight in her chest. Inside her immaculate house, family photos lined the walls. Sarah's daughter Emma at her high school graduation, now away at college in California. Emma, who had spent the last Thanksgiving break lecturing her mother about implicit bias and systemic racism. Emma, who had rolled her eyes when Sarah complained about the changing demographics of the nearby shopping center. A movement caught Sarah's eye. Through her window, she saw Marcus Harris helping an elderly Mr. Peterson from 2 doors down, who had stumbled while walking his dog. Marcus's strong hands steadied the older man with professional confidence, the 2 men sharing a laugh about something Sarah couldn't hear. The dispatcher's words echoed in her mind. Are you certain this isn't simply a family moving into their new home? Sarah watched as more neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the activity and Eleanor's infectious enthusiasm. The Patels brought over a tray of samosas. The Johnson's twins immediately gravitated toward Marcus Jr., their eyes lighting up at the mention of basketball. The scene unfolding looked like something from a feel-good movie, making Sarah's earlier actions feel increasingly grotesque. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Emma. Mom, just saw Eleanor's post about the new neighbors. The Harris family seems amazing. Dr. Renee Harris wrote that book I told you about last semester. Please tell me you're going to welcome them properly and not do anything, Sarah's chest tightened. She thought about all the times she'd prided herself on telling it like it is, and just being careful. She thought about Emma's increasingly distant phone calls and the growing disconnect between them. Inside the Harris home, boxes were being unpacked, futures were being unwrapped, and lives were beginning to intertwine with the fabric of Maple Valley estates. Sarah stood frozen at her window, watching as her neighbors created a welcome committee she had excluded herself from with a single phone call. The sound of children's laughter drifted through her window as Zara Harris discovered the tire swing in her new backyard, her joy pure and unbounded. Sarah remembered when Emma was that age, how she'd believed that the whole world was good, and everyone in it was a potential friend. A police cruiser turned slowly onto Maple Valley Drive, a delayed response to her call. Sarah's heart rate spiked as she watched Officer James Rodriguez, who had grown up in the neighborhood and whose mother still lived 3 streets over, step out of his vehicle. She knew him, had brought him lemonade during his summer patrols, had attended his police academy graduation. The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. Officer Rodriguez surveyed the scene, the moving truck, the neighbors mingling on the lawn, the obvious housewarming gathering taking shape. His eyes tracked to Sarah's partially hidden form in her window, and for a brief moment, their gazes met. She saw something in his expression. Disappointment, perhaps, or weariness, before he turned back to his cruiser, speaking briefly into his radio before pulling away. Sarah's phone buzzed once more. It was another text from Emma. "Mom, please tell me you're going to be cool about this. Remember what we talked about at Christmas?" The weight of the morning pressed down on Sarah's shoulders as she watched the community she'd thought she was protecting transform into something richer without her participation. She realized she was standing at a crossroads, one that would define not just her relationship with her new neighbors, but with her daughter, her community, and perhaps, most importantly, herself. The morning was still young, the moving truck still half full of the Harris family's belongings. Across the street, a new chapter in Maple Valley Estates was being written. Sarah Mitchell stood at her window, phone in hand, facing a decision that would ripple through her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. In her kitchen, a welcome basket she'd assembled for the previous owners of 472 sat gathering dust. She'd never delivered it because they'd moved out before she got around to it. The banana bread recipe was Emma's favorite, the one her daughter had always insisted they share with new neighbors when she was growing up. The morning stretched ahead, full of possibilities and choices. Sarah Mitchell stood in her foyer, hand on her doorknob, the weight of her earlier phone call heavy in her chest, while across the street, her neighbors continued to welcome the Harris family to Maple Valley Estates without her. The banana bread recipe card trembled in Sarah's hand as she stood in her kitchen, measuring cups lined up with military precision on her granite countertop. Through her kitchen window, she could see the ongoing welcome gathering had evolved into an impromptu block party. The Patels had brought out folding chairs, and someone, probably the Johnsons, had set up a portable tent for shade. Her phone buzzed again. Emma was calling now, not just texting. Sarah let it go to voicemail, her hands deep into flour and butter. She wasn't ready for that conversation, wasn't ready to hear the disappointment in her daughter's voice. The banana bread was her penance, her peace offering, but even as she mixed the ingredients, she knew it was inadequate. "What are you going to say?" she whispered to her empty kitchen. "Sorry I called the police on you for being black in my neighborhood?" The words hung in the air, ugly and raw. She hadn't used those words with the 911 dispatcher, had she? She'd been more careful, more coded. Suspicious individuals don't look like they belong. The euphemisms felt even worse now somehow. A burst of laughter drew her attention back to the window. Marcus Jr. was showing the Johnson twins some basketball moves on the portable hoop they'd just assembled. Sarah remembered that the Johnsons' father, Mike, had been talking about coaching the middle school basketball team. Now he was watching the kids play, nodding appreciatively at Marcus Jr.'s clearly superior skills. The bread was in the oven when Sarah heard a knock at her door. Her heart nearly stopped. Had Officer Rodriguez come back? Had he told the Harris family about her call? But when she opened the door, it was Eleanor Wong, looking elegant as always in her linen pants suit, Buddha sitting patiently at her feet. "Sarah dear, we've missed you at the welcome party," Eleanor said, her tone friendly but her eyes sharp. Eleanor had been a judge for 30 years before retiring. She'd presided over discrimination cases, Sarah suddenly remembered. The Harris family is absolutely lovely. Did you know their daughter Zara is the same age as your niece Lily? I've been baking, Sarah said weakly, gesturing toward the kitchen. Banana bread, Emma's recipe. Ah, how is Emma? Still involved in the civil rights law clinic at Berkeley? Eleanor's smile remained pleasant, but there was something knowing in her expression that made Sarah's cheeks burn. She's good, busy. She just texted me about the Harris family, actually. Sarah clutched the doorframe, unsure whether to invite Eleanor in or step out. Did she? Well, she'd love them. Dr. Renee Harris is actually speaking at Berkeley next month. Something about her new book on contemporary African American literature and social justice. Emma would find it fascinating. Eleanor paused, then added, You know, Sarah, I saw a police car drive by earlier, unusual for our quiet street on a Saturday morning. Sarah's mouth went dry. I wouldn't know anything about that. No? Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, the way it used to when she was about to deliver a verdict. You know, when John and I moved in 20 years ago, we were the first Asian American family in Maple Valley Estates. Someone called the police on us, too. The blood drained from Sarah's face. Eleanor, The officer who responded that day was James Rodriguez's father, actually. Interesting how history rhymes, isn't it? Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. The woman who made that call eventually became one of my closest friends, but first, she had to do the hard work of confronting why she made that call in the first place. The timer in Sarah's kitchen chimed. The banana bread was done. The sound hung between them like a question mark. Bring the bread when it's cooled, Eleanor said, turning to leave. And Sarah, it's not too late to make a different choice than you made this morning. As Eleanor walked away, Sarah noticed Renee Harris watching from across the street. Their eyes met briefly and Sarah quickly stepped back into her house, her heart pounding. Had Renee seen her on the phone earlier? Did she know? Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another text from Emma. Mom, seriously, call me back. Dr. Harris is literally my academic hero. Please don't make this weird. The banana bread cooled on the counter as the afternoon wore on. Sarah watched through her windows as neighbors came and went. The Harris family moved with easy grace through their new community, accepting welcomes, sharing stories, becoming part of the fabric of Maple Valley Estates while she remained isolated in her house, trapped by her own actions. Around 4 o'clock, she saw Marcus Harris helping Mr. Peterson set up a new sprinkler system, something the older man had been struggling with for weeks. She watched as Marcus Jr. taught the Johnson twins a complicated basketball move, their faces lit with concentration. She observed Renee deep in conversation with Dr. Chen from the university's English department, who must have heard about the new neighbors and stopped by to welcome a colleague. And then there was Zara, the youngest Harris, who kept looking toward Sarah's house with undisguised curiosity. Once she even waved, her smile bright and innocent, unaware of the morning's events. Sarah had automatically waved back before she could stop herself, then quickly stepped away from the window. The sun was starting to set when Sarah's doorbell rang again. This time, when she opened it, she found herself face to face with James Rodriguez, Officer Rodriguez, out of uniform now, but no less imposing. Ms. Mitchell, he said quietly, I think we need to talk about that call you made this morning. Behind him, Sarah could see Renee Harris watching from her new front porch, one hand on Zara's shoulder, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. The banana bread sat untouched on Sarah's counter, cooling in the evening air, as the consequences of her morning decision began to unfold. In her pocket, her phone buzzed one more time. Emma wasn't just texting now, she was FaceTiming. On her screen, Sarah could see her daughter's face, serious and concerned, waiting for her to answer, waiting to hear what kind of person her mother had chosen to be today. The moment stretched out like a tightrope, with Sarah balanced precariously between who she had been this morning and who she might yet become. Officer Rodriguez waited patiently on her doorstep, his presence a reminder that some conversations can't be avoided forever. Through her open door drifted the sounds of her neighbors, their voices warm and welcoming, creating a community she had tried to prevent, but that was flourishing anyway, with or without her participation. The choice was hers now. What kind of neighbor, what kind of person, what kind of mother she wanted to be. Sarah's hand trembled as she stepped aside to let Officer Rodriguez enter, The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Through her still-open door, she could see Renee Harris watching, her expression now clearly visible in the warm glow of her new porch light. "Would you like some coffee?" Sarah asked automatically, falling back on decades of suburban politeness. James Rodriguez, she'd known him since he was in high school, had attended his graduation, shook his head. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, seemingly searching for words. "I've known you my whole life. My mama still talks about how you brought her soup when she had pneumonia last winter." "James, I can explain?" "Can you?" His voice was gentle but firm. "Because I just spent 20 minutes on the phone with my supervisor, explaining why I didn't file a report about a potential racial profiling incident in my own neighborhood." Sarah sank into her armchair, her legs no longer able to support her. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. Emma was persistent. I wasn't. The excuses died in her throat. "The thing is," James continued, remaining standing, "Dr. Harris recognized me. Turns out he performed emergency surgery on my cousin Miguel last year at Boston General. Saved his life." He paused, letting that sink in. "The world's smaller than we think, Sarah." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she saw Renee Harris standing there, still elegant despite hours of moving and socializing. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Renee said, her voice rich and cultured. "But I noticed you haven't joined us yet, Ms. Mitchell, and I wanted to extend a personal invitation." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Behind Renee, she could see Marcus approaching, his face concerned. "I'm sorry," Sarah blurted out, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I'm so sorry about this morning. This morning?" Renee's eyebrow arched slightly. "You mean when you called the police on my family?" The directness of the question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She heard James inhale sharply behind her. "We saw you," Marcus said quietly, joining his wife in the doorway. "We've moved enough times to recognize the signs, the curtains, the phone, the way you disappeared when Officer Rodriguez arrived." Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, she pulled it out with shaking hands. Emma's texts filled the screen. "Mom, please tell me you didn't. OMG, Mom, seriously answer me. I swear if you did what I think you did, that's it, I'm coming home." "Emma's coming home?" Sarah whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Your daughter?" Renee asked. "The one at Berkeley? She cited my work in her papers, you know. Her professor sent me some of her essays. She's doing important work on civil rights law." The pride that would normally have flooded Sarah at this praise was overwhelmed by shame. Her daughter was doing important work on civil rights law, and her mother had just become exactly the kind of person Emma was fighting against. "I don't know how to fix this," Sarah admitted, her voice small. "No one's asking you to fix anything," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly kind. "We're asking you to learn from it." "The banana bread," Sarah said suddenly, remembering. "I made banana bread, Emma's recipe. I was going to bring it over, but then you realized you'd have to face what you did this morning," James finished for her. Another car pulled up outside, a taxi from the airport. Sarah watched through her still-open door as Emma stepped out, her Berkeley sweatshirt rumpled from travel, her face set in determined lines. "Mom," Emma called out, then stopped short when she saw the gathering in her mother's doorway. "Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris? Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I came as soon as I—" "Emma," Renee said warmly, "I recognized you from your student photo. I was just telling your mother how much I enjoyed your paper on intersectionality in modern civil rights movements." Emma's face cycled through confusion, pride, and concern. "Mom," she said again, softer this time, "what did you do?" The evening air was heavy with unspoken words and potential outcomes. In the Harris's new driveway, the moving truck was finally empty, but boxes still lined their hallway, waiting to be unpacked. Across the street, Eleanor Wong stood on her porch, Buddha at her feet, watching the scene unfold with knowing eyes. Sarah Mitchell stood in her own doorway, surrounded by the consequences of her actions, her daughter's disappointment, her neighbor's judgment, the Harris family's dignity, and Officer Rodriguez's complicated compassion. The choice she'd made that morning couldn't be unmade, but perhaps it wasn't the end of the story. From the Harris's yard, little Zara's voice carried across the gathering dusk. "Daddy, can we set up my telescope tonight? You promised we could look at the stars from our new home." The word home hung in the air like a question, a challenge, a possibility. The night was young, and Sarah Mitchell's journey from who she had been that morning to who she might become was just beginning. The real question was, what would she do next? Emma stepped forward, looking between her mother and the Harris family, her face showing the same determination Sarah recognized from childhood, when her daughter would refuse to give up until she'd solved a particularly difficult puzzle. Maybe, Emma said carefully, we should all talk. Behind them, the porch light of 472 Maple Valley Drive flickered on, casting a warm glow across both properties, illuminating paths that had been in shadow all day. We could all use some banana bread, Marcus said, breaking the tension with unexpected warmth. If the invitation still stands? Sarah nodded wordlessly, stepping back to let everyone into her home. It was surreal. The family she had called the police on just hours ago, now entering her carefully maintained living room. Emma's eyes darted around, taking in the scene, no doubt noting the partially drawn curtains that had hidden her mother's morning surveillance. Your peace lilies are beautiful, Renee commented, gesturing to the plants lining Sarah's bay window, the same window she'd stood behind that morning. I killed every houseplant I ever owned until Marcus gave me a self-watering system last year. Mom's always been good with plants, Emma said, her voice tight. She likes to control their environment, keep things exactly the way she thinks they should be. Emma, Sarah whispered, recognizing the anger beneath her daughter's words. Officer Rodriguez, James, cleared his throat. I should get going. Stay, Marcus said firmly. I think it's important that you're part of this conversation. Besides, I want to show you Miguel's latest scan results. The new cardiac procedure we used is showing promising long-term outcomes. As Sarah moved to the kitchen to get the banana bread, she could hear Emma engaging with Renee about her latest book. Her daughter's voice was animated, passionate, discussing theories and perspectives that Sarah had never understood, but that Emma had tried to explain over countless holiday dinners. Need help? A small voice asked, making Sarah jump. Zara Harris stood in the kitchen doorway, her yellow sundress now slightly dusty from moving day, her eyes curious rather than accusatory. Yes, thank you, Sarah managed. Could you get the plates from that cabinet? As Zara reached for the plates, she asked, Why were you afraid of us? The question, delivered with a child's direct simplicity, nearly caused Sarah to drop the banana bread. In the living room, the adult conversations quieted. I didn't, Sarah started, then stopped, looking at this young girl who had done nothing more threatening than move into a new house with her family. I was wrong, she finally said, the words feeling insufficient but necessary. Mom used to be afraid too, Zara said, carefully counting out plates. Not of people, but of moving here. She said people might not want us in their neighborhood. But Dad said good people are everywhere, if you give them a chance to be good. In the living room, Renee's sharp intake of breath was audible. Sarah looked up to see everyone watching the exchange between her and Zara. Your father is very wise, Sarah said softly. He's smart about hearts, Zara agreed seriously. He fixes them when they're broken. Are you broken? The question hung in the air like crystal, fragile, transparent, reflecting light in unexpected directions. Emma stepped forward. Mom, wait, Marcus interrupted gently. Let her answer. Sarah looked at the gathered faces, Marcus's thoughtful expression, Renee's measured gaze, James's professional assessment, Emma's complex mix of emotions, and Zara's simple curiosity. Maybe I am, Sarah admitted, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. Maybe that's why I did what I did this morning. But that's not an excuse. No, it's not, Renee agreed, her voice firm but not unkind. But it might be a place to start. Emma moved to the kitchen, beginning to cut the banana bread with the same precision she'd learned from her mother. You know what's ironic? She said, not looking up. This recipe originally came from Mrs. Carter, who lived here when I was little. She was the first black family in our old neighborhood before we moved here. You loved her banana bread so much, you asked for the recipe. Sarah hadn't thought about Mrs. Carter in years, hadn't remembered where the recipe came from. The memory hit her like a physical force. Mrs. Carter's warm kitchen, her patient instructions, her gentle corrections when Sarah's first attempts didn't turn out quite right. I forgot, Sarah whispered. Maybe you forgot a lot of things, Emma suggested, finally looking at her mother. Like how to see people as people. Outside, the sound of children playing could still be heard. Marcus Jr. and the Johnson twins, their basketball game continuing under the streetlights. The moving truck's engine started. The driver had finished his job and was leaving, unaware of the drama unfolding inside number 472. When I was a judge, Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. No one had heard her come in. I learned that justice and healing often look different than we expect. Sometimes they look like a group of people sharing banana bread in a kitchen, having hard conversations. Buddha patted over to Zara, who giggled as he licked her hand. The sound seemed to break something in the room's atmosphere, allowing everyone to breathe a little easier. "Marcus," Renee said suddenly, "we should get back to unpacking. Zara needs her room set up before bedtime." "I can help," Emma offered quickly. "I'm good at organizing things." "So can I," Sarah heard herself say, surprising everyone, including herself. If you'll let me." Marcus and Renee exchanged a look, one of those married couple conversations conducted entirely without words. James shifted his weight, professional instincts clearly warring with personal involvement. "On one condition," Renee finally said, her academic's precision giving weight to her words. "This isn't just about tonight. This isn't just about making yourself feel better about what happened this morning. This is about tomorrow and the next day and all the days after that. This is about doing the work to change, not just saying you're sorry. And," Marcus added, "it's about telling that story to others who might make the same choice you made this morning. It's about being brave enough to admit you were wrong, not just to us, but to yourself and to your community." The weight of their words pressed down on Sarah, heavier than the morning's shame, more substantial than her earlier regret. This wasn't going to be solved with banana bread and one evening of conversation. Emma watched her mother carefully, years of hope and disappointment visible in her expression. "Mom?" Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across both lawns. In the Harris's driveway, Zara's telescope was still waiting to be assembled, promising views of stars yet to be seen. The night stretched ahead, full of boxes to be unpacked, rooms to be arranged, and conversations to be had. Sarah Mitchell stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the people she had wronged and those who loved her anyway, poised between who she had been and who she might become. The real work, the hard work, was just beginning. The procession across the street felt like a pilgrimage, each person carrying something. Emma with a plate of banana bread, Sarah with a box of cleaning supplies, Eleanor with her wisdom, and James with his complicated role as both neighbor and officer. The Harris family led the way, Zara skipping ahead, while her parents maintained a dignified pace that somehow made Sarah feel even more ashamed of her morning's actions. Inside 472 Maple Valley Drive, boxes labeled with careful Sharpie descriptions created a cardboard maze. Sarah noticed how Marcus Jr.'s basketball trophies were already arranged on a shelf, gleaming in the dim light, a teenager's priority during a move. "The previous owners left the place a bit dusty," Renee said, running a finger along a windowsill. "We were so focused on getting the furniture in, we haven't had a chance to really clean." "I know," Sarah said without thinking. "They weren't very good about maintenance. The Petersons complained about their unkempt yard constantly." She stopped, realizing how her knowledge of the previous owners might sound after this morning's events. "You watch everyone in the neighborhood, don't you, Mom?" Emma's voice was quiet but pointed. "Always keeping track, always making sure everything's proper." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, the same window Sarah had watched through her own curtains that morning, they could see a group of people approaching. The Johnsons, the Patels, the Chens, and several other neighbors were walking up the driveway carrying cleaning supplies, food, and tools. "Sorry to interrupt," Mike Johnson called out as they approached the front door. "But the boys," he nodded toward where Marcus Jr. and his twins were still playing basketball, "mentioned you hadn't had a chance to clean before moving in. We thought we might help, if that's okay." Sarah watched as Renee's composed expression wavered slightly, emotion bleeding through her professional facade. Marcus put a hand on his wife's shoulder, squeezing gently. "That would be wonderful," he said, his voice rough. What happened next was like a choreographed dance of suburban solidarity. Mrs. Patel and Mrs. Chen took over the kitchen, armed with cleaning supplies and knowing exactly which cabinets needed the most attention. Mike Johnson and Dr. Chen headed to the garage to help Marcus set up shelves. The teenagers were assigned to help Marcus Jr. organize his room, their chatter and laughter drifting down the stairs. Sarah found herself in what would become Zara's room, helping Emma assemble a white desk, while Zara carefully arranged her books, already organized by color, a child's attempt at creating order in chaos. "I like the stars," Zara said suddenly, pointing to the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars had been left by the previous owner's children. "Dad says we can keep them up." "Your telescope," Sarah remembered. "It's still in the driveway." "We'll set it up once everything's clean," Zara said confidently. "Dad promised. He never breaks promises." The implicit comparison hung in the air, adults who keep their promises versus those who act on their prejudices. Emma's hand stilled on the desk drawer she was attaching. Downstairs, they could hear Eleanor holding court in the living room, telling stories about the neighborhood's history as she directed traffic flow between boxes. "Did you know," her voice carried up, "that this house was originally built by an immigrant family? The Kozlovs. They faced their own share of resistance when they first moved in." In the hallway, James was helping arrange family photos, carefully handling framed memories of the Harris family's life. Marcus and Renee's wedding, the children's birth announcements, graduation photos, vacation snapshots. Each image was a testament to the full, rich lives Sarah had reduced to suspicious individuals in her 911 call. "Where should we put the family portrait?" James asked, as Sarah passed by with cleaning supplies. The large photo showed the Harris family at what appeared to be a medical school graduation ceremony. Marcus in academic regalia, Renee beaming with pride, the children younger but still recognizable. They looked presidential, Sarah thought, like the kind of family that appears in magazines or on TV shows about successful professionals. "Above the fireplace," Renee said firmly. "It's important for Zara and Marcus Jr. to see themselves represented in their own home, to know they belong here." The word belong echoed in Sarah's mind, reminding her of her own words to the 911 dispatcher. "They don't look like they belong here." As if reading her thoughts, Renee added, "Every space becomes what we make of it. Every community is shaped by the choices its members make." Outside, the sound of a basketball bouncing had stopped. Through the window, Sarah could see Marcus Jr. showing Mr. Peterson how to properly set up his sprinkler system, the older man nodding appreciatively. The Johnson twins were helping unload the last few boxes from the driveway, working in seamless coordination. Sarah's phone buzzed yet again. This time, it was a notification from the neighborhood Facebook group she'd created. "Thank you to everyone who came out to help the Harris family move in. Special shout out to Marcus Jr. for helping fix Mr. Peterson's sprinkler system. Don't forget, neighborhood watch meeting next Tuesday. Let's talk about what it really means to look out for each other." Eleanor. The pointed message wasn't lost on Sarah. She looked up from her phone to find Emma watching her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You know what I'm studying in law school, Mom? Housing discrimination. The subtle ways people try to keep certain families out of certain neighborhoods. The things they say to make it sound reasonable. The systems they create to make it look legal." In Zara's room, the desk was finally assembled. The young girl immediately placed her favorite book on it, a children's astronomy guide, its pages dog-eared from frequent reading. "Can we set up my telescope now?" she asked, no one in particular. "The stars are out." Through the window, Sarah could see the night sky clearing, stars emerging one by one. The same stars Mrs. Carter used to tell her about, back when Sarah was young enough to believe that the universe was vast enough for everyone. The house was buzzing with activity, with community, with possibility. But beneath it all was an undercurrent of something else, a reckoning that wasn't finished, a conversation that couldn't end with just one evening of shared labor and banana bread. As if confirming this thought, James received a text that made his professional expression return. "Chief wants to see me tomorrow morning," he said quietly to Sarah, "to discuss the incident report I didn't file." The weight of the day's choices and their continuing consequences settled over the newly cleaned rooms of 472 Maple Valley Drive like evening dew, invisible but undeniably present. In the backyard of 472 Maple Valley Drive, Marcus Harris was assembling Zara's telescope under the emerging stars. The neighborhood had gathered around, turning what could have been a simple father-daughter moment into something larger, more symbolic. "The mount needs to be perfectly level," Zara instructed, reading from her dog-eared astronomy guide. Otherwise, the tracking won't work properly. Sarah stood at the edge of the group, watching Emma help Marcus align the telescope's base. Her daughter moved with confident purpose, as if helping a renowned surgeon set up astronomical equipment was something she did every weekend. The easy rapport between them made Sarah's chest ache. James hung back near the gate, checking his phone periodically. The text from his chief seemed to weigh on him. Sarah overheard him speaking quietly to Eleanor. 20 years on the force, he was saying, and I've never not filed a report before. But if I file it now, after everything, he gestured vaguely at the gathering. Eleanor's response was measured, her judge's training evident. Sometimes justice requires us to examine the spirit of the law, not just its letter. But whatever you decide, James, it needs to be something you can live with. The telescope was finally assembled, its sleek black form pointing skyward like an accusing finger. Marcus stepped back, letting Zara take the lead. First, she announced to the gathered crowd, we're going to look at Saturn. You can see its rings tonight. She consulted a star chart on her tablet, then began adjusting the telescope's position with practiced ease. She's been obsessed with astronomy since she was 5, Renee explained to the group. When we were looking at houses, the first thing she asked about was light pollution levels. The viewing conditions are actually quite good here, Dr. Chen commented. The neighborhood association's restrictions on outdoor lighting finally prove useful for something besides making everyone's lives difficult. Sarah felt her face flush. She'd been the one to push for those lighting restrictions, arguing about property values and aesthetic consistency. She'd never considered they might help a young black girl pursue her passion for astronomy. Got it, Zara exclaimed. Who wants to look first? To everyone's surprise, Mr. Peterson stepped forward first. The elderly man had to lean heavily on his cane as he bent to the eyepiece. Good Lord, he whispered after a moment. Would you look at that? Just floating there in the darkness, like God's own wedding ring. One by one, neighbors took turns at the telescope. Sarah watched as Zara expertly guided each person, explaining what they were seeing with infectious enthusiasm. The child she had viewed with suspicion just that morning was now teaching her neighbors about the cosmos. Marcus Jr. had finally tired of basketball and joined the group, standing protectively near his sister. Sarah noticed how he positioned himself between Zara and any newcomers to the gathering, a subtle defensive posture that spoke volumes about his experiences as an older brother, as a young black man, as someone who had likely moved into unwelcoming neighborhoods before. The thing about astronomy, Marcus said quietly, making Sarah jump, she hadn't noticed him approach, is that it puts everything in perspective. From up there, you can't see property lines or neighborhood associations or skin color. Just one pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan said. I'm so sorry, Sarah whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the 100th time that day. I know, Marcus replied, but sorry is just the beginning. The real question is, what are you going to do tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that? Emma's voice carried across the yard. Mom, Zara wants to show you something. Sarah approached the telescope with trepidation. Zara stepped aside, letting her bend to the eyepiece. The rings of Saturn filled her vision, impossibly beautiful and distant. Amazing, isn't it? Zara said. And that's just one tiny part of what's out there. Dad says the universe is so big, there's room for everyone in it, even people who are still learning to be better. Sarah straightened up, blinking back tears. She looked around the yard, at James still wrestling with his professional obligations, at Eleanor watching everything with wise eyes, at the neighbors who had come together to help a family move in, at her daughter who had flown home to confront her mother's prejudices. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the police department. Re-incident report, Narmoanuthos 24, 147. Please come to the station tomorrow at 9 a.m. to provide a formal statement regarding your 911 call this morning. The weight of accountability settled over her like a blanket. This wasn't going to go away with one evening of stargazing and community service. I'll go with you, Emma said, reading the message over her shoulder. Not to save you from consequences, but to make sure you face them properly. In the background, Zara was already setting up the telescope for its next target. Jupiter's next, she announced. You can see its moons. More neighbors were arriving, drawn by word of mouth about the impromptu star party. Sarah watched as Renee gracefully navigated the social dynamics, making introductions, building connections, doing the work of community building that Sarah had tried to prevent that morning. Marcus Jr. had taken over the basketball coaching with the Johnson twins, their shouts punctuating the quieter conversations around the telescope. Mr. Peterson was deep in discussion with Marcus about cardiac health and exercise recommendations for seniors. The night was far from over, and tomorrow loomed with its own challenges. The police station, the formal statement, the consequences that would ripple through their lives. But for now, under Saturn's distant rings and Jupiter's watchful moons, something was shifting in Maple Valley Estates. Zara's voice cut through Sarah's thoughts. Did you know that some stars we see are actually entire galaxies? And some of them are so far away that by the time their light reaches us, they've changed completely? The metaphor wasn't lost on Sarah. Change was possible, even if it took light years to reach its destination. The real question was she ready to begin that journey? As the evening deepened, clouds began rolling in, gradually obscuring the stars. Zara's disappointment was palpable as Jupiter disappeared behind a bank of gray. Sometimes, Marcus said, helping his daughter cover the telescope, we have to wait for clearer skies. The important thing is being ready when they come. Sarah stood nearby, hyper-aware of her presence at the edges of these family moments. She watched Emma help pack up the telescope, noticed how naturally her daughter had integrated herself into the Harris family dynamic. It was like watching an alternate version of reality, one where this morning's 911 call had never happened, where the Harrises had been welcomed properly from the start. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the Neighborhood Association Board. Emergency meeting called for Wednesday evening to discuss today's events and review community guidelines. Attendance mandatory for all board members. Eleanor. Sarah was the board president, a role she'd held for 3 years, during which she'd pushed through numerous quality-of-life regulations that now felt like thinly veiled barriers. Each one would need to be examined, reconsidered, dismantled. You're thinking too far ahead, Eleanor said softly, appearing beside her with Buddha. Tomorrow first, one step at a time. Inside 472, the house had been transformed. The combined efforts of the neighbors had turned a box-filled chaos into the beginnings of a home. Family photos lined the walls, furniture had found its proper place, and the kitchen, thanks to Mrs. Patel and Mrs. Chen, gleamed with promise. We should head home, Mr. Peterson announced, his voice carrying across the yard. Some of us have an early morning tomorrow. He looked pointedly at Sarah, then James. The police station visit loomed like a storm cloud heavier than those that had obscured the stars. As neighbors began to disperse, Sarah noticed Marcus Jr. hanging back, his expression troubled. He was typing something on his phone, then deleting it, then typing again. Everything okay? She heard Emma ask him. Just trying to figure out how to tell my friends back in Boston about today, he replied. How do you explain something like this? Yeah, first day in the new house. Neighbor called the cops on us, but then everyone came over and helped us move in, and now we're all looking at stars together. Emma's response was quiet, but carried clearly in the evening air. You tell them the truth. That change is possible, but it's never simple. That communities can learn and grow, but only if they're willing to face their failures honestly. Sarah felt the words like physical blows. Her daughter had grown into someone wise beyond her years, while she... Mrs. Mitchell? Marcus Jr.'s voice interrupted her thoughts. He'd approached while she was lost in reflection. I have a basketball game next week, first one at the new school. Would you come? Mom and Dad will be there, and Emma said she's staying in town for a while, so... The invitation hung in the air like the last visible star before the clouds had rolled in, bright, hopeful, and terrifyingly fragile. Sarah began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this teenage boy was offering. Not forgiveness exactly, but a chance, a beginning. I'd be honored, she finally managed. But are you sure you want me there? Marcus Jr. shrugged, a perfectly teenage gesture that somehow carried the weight of generations. Mom always says you have to give people room to be better than their worst moments. Otherwise, what's the point? From the front porch, Renee had been watching this exchange. She stepped forward now, her academic's precision giving way to something more personal. Tomorrow's going to be difficult, she said to Sarah. The police statement, the neighborhood association, the conversations that will need to happen. But tonight Tonight showed us something important about this community, about who it could become. About who we all could become, Emma added, coming to stand beside her mother. The clouds continued to gather, promising rain. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a summer storm approaching. Marcus began gathering up the telescope equipment more quickly, while Zara ran to rescue her star charts from the impending downpour. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly. Let me help you get everything inside before the storm hits." As they worked together, Sarah, Emma, the Harris family, and the few remaining neighbors, the first fat droplets of rain began to fall. The telescope was safely stored in the garage, the star charts rescued, the new home secured against the coming storm. But even as they rushed to finish, Sarah couldn't help but notice how the rain was falling equally on everyone, making no distinctions between old residents and new, between those who had caused harm and those who had suffered it, between those who needed to change and those who were helping them learn how. Tomorrow would bring its own storms: the police station at 9 a.m., the formal statement, the neighborhood association meeting, the long process of examining and dismantling the barriers she had helped create. But tonight, as the summer rain washed over Maple Valley Estates, something else was being washed away too. Not the responsibility for her actions, but perhaps some of the invisible lines that had divided their community for so long. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now. In the garage, Zara was already talking about how they would need to recalibrate the telescope after the rain. Marcus Jr. was making plans with Emma to practice basketball before his game. Renee was exchanging numbers with Mrs. Patel to discuss recipes. Marcus was promising to look at Mr. Peterson's heart medication list. Life was moving forward, weaving new patterns, creating new connections. The question was, what role would Sarah Mitchell play in this new tapestry being woven in Maple Valley Estates? The rain continued to fall, and tomorrow continued to approach, carrying with it all the weight of consequence and possibility. The morning dawned clear after the storm, the sun rising over Maple Valley Estates with unforgiving brightness. Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her blazer, armor for the day ahead. Through her window, she could see the Harris family's house, already alive with morning activity. Zara was helping her father clean the telescope lens, still damp from last night's rain. The police station interview was brief but consequential. Sarah sat straight-backed in the hard plastic chair, Emma beside her, and told the complete truth. Yes, she had called 911. Yes, it was because the family was black. No, there had been no actual suspicious activity. Yes, she understood the seriousness of misusing emergency services. Yes, she understood this would be part of her permanent record. "I want to file a formal retraction," she said clearly, while Emma squeezed her hand, "and I want it noted that I'm enrolling in the Community Bias Training Program." The police chief, James Rodriguez's supervisor, watched her thoughtfully. "You understand this doesn't just go away?" "I don't want it to go away," Sarah replied. "I need to remember it." That afternoon, the neighborhood association meeting was standing room only. Eleanor had insisted it be held in the community center rather than someone's living room. This needed to be official, public, documented. Sarah stood at the podium, her prepared statement trembling in her hands. But when she looked up, she saw Renee Harris sitting in the front row, grading papers as if this were just another meeting. Marcus Jr. was in the back, still in his basketball practice clothes, the Johnson twins beside him. Emma sat with Zara, who was reading her astronomy book, apparently uninterested in adult matters. "I've been the association president for 3 years," Sarah began. "In that time, I've promoted and passed 17 different regulations about property maintenance, noise control, architectural consistency, and other so-called quality of life issues. Today, I'm proposing we review every single one of them." A murmur went through the room. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "Yesterday, I was shown what real quality of life looks like. It looks like neighbors helping neighbors. It looks like children sharing their passions. It looks like second chances and hard conversations. It looks like a community brave enough to face its flaws and work to correct them." By the time the meeting ended, the association had voted to create a new diversity and inclusion committee with Renee Harris and Eleanor Wong as co-chairs. The architectural consistency regulations were suspended pending review. The property maintenance standards would be replaced with a community assistance program for elderly or disabled residents who needed help with yard work. 1 week later, Sarah sat in the bleachers at Marcus Jr.'s first basketball game. The Harris family had a whole cheering section. Half of Maple Valley Estates had turned out. When Marcus Jr. scored the winning basket, Sarah found herself cheering just as loudly as everyone else. After the game, Zara tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "The skies are really clear tonight," she said. "Want to come over? Dad got me a new lens for the telescope." That evening, as Sarah stood in the Harris' backyard, watching Zara explain the difference between red giants and white dwarfs, she felt Emma's arm slip through hers. "You know what the hardest part of studying civil rights law is?" Emma asked quietly. "Learning that change is possible, but it's never finished. It's something you have to choose every day." "Like adjusting a telescope," Sarah said, thinking of Zara's careful calibrations. "Always fine-tuning, always trying to see more clearly." A month after the moving day that had changed everything, Sarah stood at her bay window again. The curtains were pulled completely open now. Across the street, she watched the usual morning routine. Marcus heading to the hospital for his early surgery shift. Renee corralling the kids into her car for school drop-off before her university classes. Her phone buzzed. The neighborhood association group chat, no longer just a surveillance tool, but a genuine community forum. Reminder, community potluck this Saturday at the Harrises. Zara's doing a presentation on the autumn constellations. Bringing my famous lasagna. Mrs. Patel. Save me a seat by the telescope. Mr. Peterson. Basketball hoops all set up for anyone who wants to play. Marcus Jr. Sarah smiled and added her own message. I'll bring the banana bread, Mrs. Carter's recipe. As she typed, she noticed a moving truck turning onto Maple Valley Drive. New neighbors for 468, a Hispanic family she'd heard. The mother was a pediatric nurse who would be working with Marcus at the hospital. Sarah put down her phone and picked up her welcome basket. There were stars yet to be seen, games yet to be played, bread yet to be shared, and conversations yet to be had. But now she knew. A community, like the universe itself, was constant in only one thing: change. And in Maple Valley Estates, that change was finally bending toward justice. One telescope adjustment, one basketball game, one difficult conversation at a time.